Welcome to Highland Waves, a podcast originating from Marshbrook Studios located beside the world-renowned Margaree River in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. Highland Waves feature stories about the people, places and visitors of Inverness County. I'm Pat Wall, your host, and this morning I'm pleased to introduce quintessential multi-species angler and conservationist Laurie McDonald. Good morning, Laurie. Welcome to Highland Waves.
Hello, Pat.
A few years ago, Grant McClintock, in his book Watermark, he talks about meeting you on the Margaree River. I think it was on the Forks Pool. And he says that you keep sea lice from each Atlantic salmon you catch on a card. And you said, quote, "We all keep count on the river." What did you mean by that statement?
Well, about the sea lice, there was a small fly shop. I forget the gentleman's name. It was right by the garden pool across the street in a trailer. And he always, in those days, when it was bad weather, especially coming on the fall, and there was big runs coming up, big runs of salmon, he always wanted to know how I was doing, because very few people were on the river, period. I was often alone for many days in that stretch of river. And so I always peeled off the sea lice, put them in a little can, and I went up and showed him. He got a kick out of that.
So that's where it originated.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about sea lice. They're on fish when they come into the river, and just as they hit the salt water, these begin to fall off. Is that correct?
Well, they're still, oftentimes they're still on the fish, well up into the river, sometimes miles upriver, and it seems to be that there's the sea lice, and the sea lice have actually tails on them. The sea lice are probably a centimeter or two long, probably a centimeter, and then the tails are probably 3 centimeters long. And it seems the tails fall off probably within 12 hours of exposure to fresh water, and the sea lice themselves probably 24 hours tops, and then they're gone. So you can be pretty well assured that if there's sea lice with tails on the salmon that you've caught, that they've been in the river a very short time.
It's a fresh fish.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen one occasion. I'll never forget one salmon that I caught on the Shetty Camp River. It probably had, if it didn't have 200 sea lice, I would be surprised, and maybe more. The body was completely covered with sea lice. I've never seen anything like it. So yeah. So where did it all start for you, fly fishing for Atlantic salmon? Fly fishing for Atlantic salmon actually started, I went to St. Avex back in the 80s, and there was a friend of mine I went to school with from Guysborough, and his uncle was fisheries officer actually there. And so when I went to Guysborough to visit him, he said, "You should come over," because my uncle's a fly fisherman, and he knew that I liked fly fishing. I was always fishing anything all the time, and fly fishing for trout, but I wanted to try salmon when I was younger, and so I went visit, and the fisheries DFO officer. And I'm not going to mention his name because you'll understand that in a couple of minutes. But anyway, we went and we fished the Salmon River in Guysborough. And he had given me a fly. I think it was a black bear silver butt. And he said, "Now, I just rose one." So he said, "Come here." And he said, "You cast about 6 feet away from that rock and let it swing into the rock." And then he went on and he was fishing down below. So I made a few casts, and I could see it was sunny out. I could see a flash every time I made a cast. And then I went to make a probably fifth or sixth cast. I went to draw back to make another cast, and everything came tight. And then all of a sudden the salmon started going downriver. It was very close to the ocean. You can see the ocean from this pool. It's tidal pool. You only fish it on the outgoing tide. And the salmon took off, and next thing you know, the fishery officer is right on my side, and he's saying, "You better go." He said, "Chase that fish." And then I went so fast on those rocks, all I could hear in the background was the fisheries officer saying, slow down," because I guess I was hoofing her while I was young back then. And then all of a sudden, I was on the beach. It was way down in the salt water, and I thought I had lost him, but he was just in the waves. And the salmon came in, and it ran so far and so fast that all I could see coming in, I was reeling them up now. The salmon was spent out, and it was a big gross, so we could keep them. And salmon came in tail first, and I had him hooked right by the bar of the tail, the very first salmon. And I guess when he came up for the fly, and I went to cast, I got him right by the tail. So it went off like a bat out of hell. And then the fisheries officer came over, and he said, "Laurie," he said. He grabbed the salmon. He said, "You're supposed to release a foul-hooked fish." He said, "But he said, in this case, we're going to make an exception." He said, "You put your tag on that, and when we go back home, you tell everybody that everything was fantastic and fun and great, and that's all. We're not going to say anything else about this." So I won't say the officer's name, but that was when I first started many years ago.
He probably made a good decision.
Yeah.
So from St. Avex, where did you go from there?
St. Avex, went to Inuvik, and with that same friend from Guysborough, and he worked in the hospital, and I worked at the local bar, the local native pub, which was interesting to say the least. I can remember the first day in the job, I was surrounded by 3 or 4 gentlemen from Tuktoyaktuk, and they all had knives, and they were brandishing them, and they all threatened me right there. And then, because I was told by the owner, the lady Heidi, the German lady that owned the place, that I wasn't to serve anybody that was intoxicated. So these 3 or 4 gentlemen were lambasted drunk, and I said, "I can't serve you, and I can't serve you, and I can't serve you." So that's why they got up, and they had all their knives out, and they were saying, "Well, we'll cut you, blah blah blah." So I said, "Yeah, okay, guys." I said, "If that's the way you're going to be," I threw my tray in the corner, and I said, "If that's the way you're going to be," I said, "You're all getting served. If you can make it to the bar, you can get your beer." So that's the last time I left the bar, and I stayed behind the bar, and I served everybody. There was and it was quite a 4 months.
Yeah,
session.
I imagine.
Yeah.
So did you fish while you were in Inuvik?
No, I didn't fish. It was in the winter. I only worked winters for many years because I had to be back here for June to fish the salmon. I was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my life was pretty much geared towards being free from June to October for a couple of decades there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In McGlintick's book, he also says that, and I'm quoting him again, is Laurie, as a young man, wandered in the desert of obsession, a nervous land where one takes fish like drugs. You can explain that statement?
Well, I suppose he refers to the fact that I was so obsessed with angling, and there's something about the Atlantic salmon that is addictive. The way they take the fly, the way they come up and take the dry fly, and oftentimes it wasn't out of the ordinary to raise a fish 5 and 10 times, and I've risen fish 50 and 60 times, and from the time of 7 in the morning, and then I'll hook them at 2 in the afternoon on the Sheddycamp River, which I had primarily to myself for many years. And so I was probably as addicted to that as anyone that would have been addicted to drugs. Yeah.
What are your favorite rivers to fish for Atlantic salmon?
You know, I really like the river that is as little as I go back there. I really like the Salmon River in Guysborough. Hardly ever go back there. But the Shetty Camp and the Margaree for sure. The Margaree probably the number one river for me. In the 90s, I suppose I fished it more than anyone. I guess I was there the entire season. The Margaree, I suppose, would have to be the number one.
What are the differences in the rivers that you fish, like the Shetty Camp and the Margaree? What are the main differences? And well, of course, the Shetty Camp River is a much more rugged river than the Margaree is. But apart from that, what are the other subtle differences with respect to those rivers when it comes to fishing for Atlantic salmon?
So the Shetty Camp is much smaller than the Margaree, and probably the difference that stands out the most would be the proximity to the salmon when they come for the fly, and the Shetty Camp is much more intimate. You're in certain spots you're within 5 or 6 feet from the salmon, and you dare not move, or you'll spook them in lower water. You're very close to them, so it's that's probably the biggest difference. Whereas the Margaree, you're at best usually 50, 60 feet, and sometimes I fished the high bank for many years with Henry Green, and not uncommon to be 100 or more feet away from them. So that's probably the biggest difference.
Of course, in the course of your travels in Atlantic salmon, fishing for them, you always run into different types of people. What are the differences in the people that you meet on the Shetty Camp, for example, and the people you meet on the Margaree?
On the Shetty Camp, we see somebody on the Shetty Camp, and there's very few people that fish it anymore. There's probably half a dozen of us that'll fish it more than once or twice a season now. And so I suppose when we see somebody come up, we'll ask them a lot of questions: what they're doing here, how they found the place, and so it's I'd say it's more personable on the Shetty Camp. It's more of an intimate experience, whereas the Margaree, you get a lot of people from a lot of different places. Still very nice people, and you just not as you're not gonna meet somebody on the Margaree and ask them, how did you find out about this river, as much as the Shetty Camp, because we like to keep that a little bit hush hush more. It's a difficult river to fish because of the access. And the danger involved and the rocks, and you really have to know what you're doing. So that's another reason we kind of take anybody we see up there aside and help them for safety.
Give them a few instructions.
Yeah, and that's right. It's not easy when you get 3 or 4 guys that's fished it for 30 years, and there's only going to be 3 or 4 fish hooked in a morning. You better listen when somebody gives you any form of advice, but we'll always help the new guy.
I got a good friend on there who fishes it regularly. He's from there. It's Rennie O'Coin. You probably know Rennie.
Renee, yes. Renee's. I remember when I first started fishing, Renee was already at it and very, very accomplished angler.
Yeah. Have you fished the rivers in Newfoundland or Labrador?
I went to Newfoundland. It's been over probably 15, 20 years since I went there, and I fished the exploits and Little Rattling Brook that flows into it. I fished the Pinware, but we were early. It was a late run that year. There was still ice in the harbor, so we didn't have much luck there. But I went to Main River in Sops Arm, and had great fishing there, for grills.
It's It's an interesting comment you make about the Pinware River, about it being rocky, because it's somewhat similar to the Cheticamp River in that regard.
It is indeed. It's like a giant Cheticamp.
That's right. You're retired now. Overall, how many days how many days a year do you fish on the river?
Well, that's a good question. I fished the entire month of June this year, and the last couple of weeks I've been taking a break. I've been fly fishing every day, but I enjoy striper fishing on the beach. I go and I take my partner Flora May with me, and we go on the beach and fish stripers, and it's great. There's lots of action and lots of surface fishing. It's fun. I do occasionally go to the Margaree in recent days, but I've fished the rivers so much over so many years that it's nice to get away from it for a week or two while it's in the season to do other things. I travel a lot too. I now that I've been retired a couple of years, and I've been going west for many years. Since over 30 years, I've been fishing the beaches on Vancouver Island, which is an incredible fishery, and I still do that. I'll be there 3 months this year, and then the winter I go down south and fish down there.
Do you tie your own flies?
Yeah, of course we have to. You not only would you be in the poorhouse if you didn't, you'd be hard pressed to get up and find somebody at 3 a.m. and say, look, I need a fly by 3:30 because that's when we're going up tomorrow. And
of course, it depends on conditions, water levels, etc. But what is your favorite type of fly to fish, dry or wet?
I enjoy the wet fly because I fish the dry fly so much. If I had to pick one for sure, it would be the dry fly dead drifting on the Margaree. It's fantastic, and I've seen too much of it, and that's why I'm so obsessed with it. Years ago, when there was, that the knowledgeable fishermen were few and far between. Now there's a lot of fishermen, and there's social media, and everybody seems to know where all the. Back then, it wasn't the case. There was a handful of us on the Margaree that had all those fish to ourselves, essentially. And so we had so many fish to the dry fly. I guess that's when the Atlantic salmon takes the dry fly. I suppose that is the number one thing. I mean, that's probably why the history is so storied on the Margaree and the Atlantic salmon is the way they take it. They certainly don't fight like a bonefish, but it's the take that's just fantastic.
With the advent of different rods these days, what are you using regularly for fly fishing for Atlantic salmon?
This year I've got so many rods. I don't know exactly how many I have, but it's many dozens, and that I've accumulated over the years. This year I'm using a 13-foot 3. I used a 14-foot probably the most over the years on the Margaree, and this year I'm using a 13-foot 3-inch 7-weight that I really like. It's a little lighter, but it's nowadays the rods are so fast, which I like. I like the fast action.
Do you spey cast, switch cast?
I don't.
Overhead?
I fish a single spey often. I don't like switch rods. I either like to fish a two-hander or I like to fish a single-handed rod. And I like 10-footers on the river for my single-handed rod. I suppose because of the mending ability and the reaching and stuff. But the 14-footer was the rod that I used most, and I have many, many 14-footers that I've used over the years. As the new ones came out, I've tried them, and so I suppose the 14-footer would be my favorite on the Margarine.
Okay. Since you started fishing for Atlantic salmon, certainly the numbers have gone down dramatically. What do you suggest can be done to increase those numbers?
Well, it was Leonard Forsyth, I suppose, that made it what it was when I started fishing, and the hatchery and Leonard always used to say, look, if we weren't doing this at the hatchery, there would not be the runs, those Rocky Brook fish from New Brunswick. I think they were from tributary to the Miramichi, if I may be mistaken there, but over half the fish in the Margarine now are of that gene pool, because they were getting brood stock or from New Brunswick and seeding the Margarine with it. And I believe that's probably why that the Margarine had those great years when I was fishing. Certainly prior to that, it was all Margarine fish, the original stock that was broad-shouldered and thick through the body, and you still get some of those fish. But primarily now it's mixed fish in the Margarine, and that's a good thing, because otherwise, and I imagine most of the fish that went away were taken in the salt water, whether it was those many mile long nets from the Spanish or whoever's doing it. God knows.
Do you think DFO is doing enough?
From an angler's perspective, I don't think anybody's doing enough. I think that the Atlantic salmon is such a valuable resource that I don't think anybody will realize that until they're gone, and many years after they're gone. Probably the same as many things in our world now.
There are more people fishing now than ever. You think there should be some restrictions, more restrictions on people? Like in Quebec, they have a lottery system for people to go on the river. Again, from an angler's perspective, it wouldn't ruin my day if the people that were not residents of Nova Scotia had to abide by the same rules as the people in Newfoundland. When I go to Newfoundland, I have to have a guide with me as a non-resident. But when the Newfoundlander that guides me there comes to Nova Scotia and he fishes on his own, then I think that maybe that would be a good thing. It would lessen the crowds, and it would make for perhaps a better experience for those of us that live here. And so you're in favor of mandatory guides here in Nova Scotia if that took place?
Perhaps in the rivers.
Okay. What do you think of catch and release?
In my years, and I was lucky enough to start after the moratorium of the netting, and after you couldn't keep the big ones anymore, they stopped that. There was very few people on the river where I grew up, and I had it to myself for many years, and essentially to myself. There was people that come on the weekends, and they'd leave on Sunday, and then I'd have to myself for another 4 or 5 days, for many years, and so I saw I saw. Okay, give me that question again. I'm going off on a different
I was asking
direction
about catch and release, and what do you think of catch and release?
Sorry. So that being said, the stocks rebounded sharply in those years. Renee had told me one year that there was a year that there was only one salmon caught, and that was around the time when they ceased keeping the big ones. When you could keep the big ones, the guys would go up there with their wives and their sisters and their cousins, and everybody would have a tag. And there was one guy there that knew how to fish, and he was towing about 6 guys with him, and everybody had put their tag on his fish, and so the fish, eventually disappeared because they were killing them all, so there was none left to spawn. So after they stopped keeping the big ones, it was all catch and release, hook and release they called it. So in short order, 3 or 4 years, the stocks rebounded sharply, and there was very few of us on the river, and there was lots of salmon, and we had lots of luck, and we caught lots of salmon for many years. And I think I could count on one hand how many salmon died out of the thousands that we released over many, many years. Less than a half a dozen I've ever seen die. So it's kind of funny you ask me that, because I read a blog the other day on catch and release, and these people were against it, and fish mortality of 30 up to 30-40%. Anyway, it was all hogwash. I know, because I lived on the river all my life, so I felt compelled. You had to leave a comment, but you had to join and blah blah. I didn't know how to get into there, but hook and release, catch and release, it works as long as you know how to handle the fish. And,
correct.
And there was many times when many people were relatively new to the fishing, but in the Margaree especially, but very few fish died, even in the hands of the less experienced.
So you are in favor of hook and release?
I am, yeah.
Would you like to keep a fish once in a while?
Well, again, for the same reason that in Nova Scotia, I don't know if it's because of the economy or what it is, but it seems like if there's anything available for free, then people sort of, they exploit it. So in that case, I really don't think I'd like to see the retention come back. And
well,
yeah,
lots of people feel that same way. I understand you fish for salmon out west as well.
Yes.
Fish on Vancouver Island.
Yeah.
What species do you fish for there?
I fish primarily for coho.
Okay.
Which the Americans call them silvers. And yeah, it's a fantastic fishery. I lived in Campbell River for 5 or 6 years when I was in my younger days, and again there, Nova Scotia, I had the childhood of a dream childhood of a fly fisherman here, and when I moved to Campbell River, I had the same there. It was a real fantastic place for fly fishing, and I did fly fish the rivers there somewhat, but when I discovered the saltwater fishery, when especially the coho, when they were migrating towards their rivers of origin, and they would be staging to go up the rivers along the beaches, and were still feeding, and still chrome silver, and you could target them before they were heading in the beaches, and we fished them all on a I fished them with a dry line and you know, and a long leader. The water's gin clear, but it's an amazing fishery. Yeah, there's a lot to it to discuss there, but that's an incredible fishery.
Which do you prefer, Atlantic salmon or West Coast fishing?
If there was one salmon to be caught, of course, I'd like to have that Atlantic take the dry fly.
The species are bigger?
The coho, no. The Atlantics tend to be a little bit bigger. The coho I'm fishing, in certain areas they do get bigger, but they're run about 7 to 15 pounds typically, and the typical fish are 7-8 pounds, the ones we're fishing on the island. Now they're bigger up in other areas north of where I usually go on the island, but the ones I've been fishing, they're 7, 8, 10 pounds.
And you go south as well?
Yeah, I have been since I've been retired. Yeah,
Fish for bonefish or sailfish or what species?
I fish for bonefish primarily.
Bonefish.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. Beyond my wildest dreams, what you can do down there if you. I went on Google one day and I said best bone fishing, biggest bonefish in the world, and boom, this island came up, and I went to that island, and I had the most incredible time, and I'll be going back every year. Yeah, it's.
Are the fighter like an Atlantic salmon? Do you fight more vigorous or?
Well, a 10-pound Atlantic jumps, and he has a good fight, but a 10-pound bonefish. There's not very much comparison. The 10-pound bonefish he'll go a football field, and then he'll stop, and then you're wondering now, now you'll know why you put 200 yards of backing on your reel, because they go so far, so fast, and so they don't jump, but they're faster and stronger than the Atlantic. Yeah, not as much of a bulldog as the Atlantic, but just a real rocket that they go in a straight line, fast.
You're fishing them in clear water, so you have to be more careful as you approach them, I would assume.
It's a totally different game, yeah, and you do have to be careful. And I remember a guide that was recommended by a tarpon guide in Florida had told me, you go with this gentleman, and he'll not only be the best guide you've ever been out with, he said, this will be the best guide you'll ever meet in your life. So I went out with him, and sure enough, it was true. A phenomenal guide, like unbelievable. And he would constantly tell me, you're making too much noise, and I was walking as softly as I could. So yeah, and when I went out with him, we saw hundreds of bonefish on the same flats that I'd go alone, and I would rarely see a bonefish.
Okay.
And as you go, well, I was there 60 days all day last year, so I learned a lot in that session. So it's new to me, that thing, that game.
It's a great life that you have. And I'm just wondering whether you have any advice for people, particularly for Atlantic salmon fishing.
Well, for my life was, well, I had a father that was, he was a very intelligent man. He thought outside the box. He really geared me up to leave Shetty Camp, to experience it. If I wanted to come back, then that would have been my choice. But by the time he got through with me, it was no trouble with me getting a job or being successful. He had given me so much confidence. So I am looking through the world through a different window, because very few people have the luxury that I had with my upbringing, in my opinion, what I see around me. But my advice to Atlantic salmon fishermen is, perhaps don't get too deep into it, because it can rule your life, and you could lose your wife, and you could do a lot of negative stuff to you. That would probably be on the top of my mind, yes.
Well, Laurie, thank you for joining us this morning. I wish you every success and pleasure on whatever river you cast it over. And I hope maybe one day we'll meet on one of them. And tight lines. And to our listeners, thank you for being with us. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons so you can stay up to date. And today's thought is from the famous writer Ernest Hemingway, who was also a great fisherman. He said, "Fishing is a discipline in the equality of life and men, for all men are equal before fish." So long for now, Pat.